Okay, so I'm very honored. I feel very honored to join this session along with distinguished scholars from whose works I learned a lot. And today my topic is Transformation of Korean Studies in Japan, with the subtitle, Decolonization, the Cold War, and the New Cold War. And today I will first review the changes Korean studies underwent in post-war Japan, distinguishing 4 stages of the process, and will try to put them into a broader historical perspective. Then, based on this review, I'd like to point out new challenges that Korean studies in Japan are facing present day. Within that context, I will also consider the impact of the new Cold War emerging in this region of East Asia on Korean studies and the general perception of Korea in the 21st century in Japan. And as is often the case with area studies in Western powers, Western countries, such as the United States, about which I think Professor Yu some minutes ago gave us a very wonderful summary based on Bruce Cummings' works, books, and articles. Korean studies in Japan was also born in tandem with the nation's imperial expansion into the Korean Peninsula. So in 1880, 4 years after the Treaty of Ganhwa was concluded, the first course of Korean language was established in the Japanese higher education institution called Tokyo Foreign Language School. It's a national school, later named Tokyo Foreign Language University. Korean was the 5th language course, foreign language course established at the school after French, German, Prussian, and Chinese, which shows the relative importance of the Korean language for the Japanese. As Japan began to expand its influence over the Korean Peninsula, the nation needed to systemize and institutionalize Korean studies as an academic field to serve the nation's policies. So in 1916, 6 years after the annexation of Korea, courses of Korean history were established for the first time in the top 2 imperial universities in Tokyo and Kyoto. And academic studies on Korean history began to emerge, such as Shiratori Kurakichi's critique of Dangun myth and Shidehara Taichi's work on Dangpa, Dangjeng, during the Joseon dynasty. And since Japan annexed Korea in 1910, however, the locus of Korean studies moved from Japan proper to colonial Joseon. To borrow the words of Japanese historian Yoshida Mitsuo, former the professor of the University of Tokyo, Keijo, the Japanized name of Seoul during the colonial period, became the center of Korean studies in pre-war Japan. On the other hand, Korean studies in Japan proper waned. The Korean language course at the Tokyo Foreign Language University was suspended in 1916. The expansion of Korean studies was an integral part to the consolidating process of Japanese colonial rule over Korea. In 1924, Keijo Imperial University was established in Seoul as the 6th Imperial University and the first one outside of Japan. It covered a wide range of disciplines from humanities to social science, history, politics, economics, and sociology, laying the foundation of so-called modern academic studies of Korea. It was the Keijo Imperial University. It was located in Seoul, Korea, but not for or by Koreans. The faculty membership was completely monopolized by Japanese. There were no Korean professors until the end of the colonial rule, and during which only a few were employed as lecturers. In particular, courses of Korean history were never allowed to be taught by Koreans themselves. Chosen Sotokufu was another center for studies of Korean history. It established the Committee for the Compilation of Korean History in 1925, which implemented very ambitious and comprehensive research of Korean history from antiquity to the modern period. Needless to say, the purpose was to rewrite Korean history to justify colonial rule. And after the end of the Second World War, the Japanese scholars who worked in Korea returned to Japan to take positions as experts on Korea at universities and research institutions. As such, the first generation of Korean studies in post-war Japan was characterized by a very clear continuity from its colonial past. In 1950, Chosen Gakkai, Academic Association of Korean Knowledge in Japan, was founded as the first academic association of Korean studies in post-war Japan. The leadership of the organization was composed of two groups. The first one was the group of former professors at the Keijo Imperial University and the historians working for the Sotokufu. The second one was Tenrikyo, a Shinto sect which was very active in colonial Chosen. The Chosen Gakkai has remained still today at the center of Korean studies in post-war Japan until present day. We can call them traditionalists, to borrow the term from the debate on Cold War historiography. Continuity between pre-war and post-war Japan was most evident in the perception and studies of Korea than in any other areas. For instance, Suzuki Takeo, an economist and former professor teaching at Keijo Imperial University, who returned to become a professor at the University of Tokyo, argued that post-colonial Korea would have economic difficulties without a reconnection to Japan. So post-war Japanese society in general lost interest in Korea, and there was a very weak demand for Korean studies. Thanks to the US Cold War strategy that sought to reconstruct Japan as the regional bulwark of containment, historical issues regarding colonialism and war were either contained, erased, and effectively relegated to oblivion. And since the late 1950s and early 60s, kind of Japanese version of the new left revisionist in Cold War historiography, that is a group of post-war generation liberal progressive scholars in Korea, began to raise alternative voices criticizing the colonialist, neo-colonialist view of the traditionalists. Hatada Takashi and Kajimura Hideki were among the leading historians in Korea. It is noteworthy that I'd like to emphasize that the Koreans in Japan, Zainichi historians, worked hand in hand with the Japanese post-war liberals to build this new trend. They played a pivotal role in the movement. As their central organization, Chosenshi Kenkyukai was established in 1959. One of the founding principles was the equality of nationality in its operation to show solidarity between Korea and Japan. The secretariat of Chosenshi Kenkyukai was composed of Koreans and Japanese scholars in exactly equal number. They criticized the colonialist view of Korean history, such as the arguments of stagnation, 정체론, or absence of subjectivity, 타율성론, and put forward a theory of indigenous development, 내재적 발전론. However, they were also affected by the Cold War situation structure. Their perception of the realities of the two Koreas was more ideological than empirical. And in 1965, relations between Japan and the ROK, Republic of Korea, were so-called normalized, with an increasing contact with South Korea, Korean studies in Japan also began to change, breeding the third generation of scholars, whom I would call post-revisionist, again borrowing a term from Cold War historiography. They were less ideological and more empirical and kind of academic. And different from their predecessors, they were endowed with the opportunities of studying in post-war South Korea to get first-hand experiences in the country's fast-changing political, economic, and social realities, from dictatorship to democratization and phenomenal economic growth. This third generation of Korean studies in Japan had a certain comparative advantage over other foreign countries in terms of a historical and geographical vicinity. It also had academic freedom that was lacking in both Koreas. Until the late 1980s, at a time when free and objective scholarship in Korea was oppressed by Cold War authoritarianism, Korean studies in Japan made, I believe, definite contributions to the progress of the field, qualitatively and quantitatively. I remember that back in the 1970s, when I was a college student, the books and articles smuggled from Japan were the main sources of our information, knowledge of the realities in both Korea's politics, economy, and society. At the time, I recall that it was a kind of rule among the student movement groups members to study Japanese grammar, to read these prohibited materials smuggled from Japan. And to give you a sense of the change and the status of the Korean studies in Japan, I will briefly introduce some simple figures. The first is the number of books and articles on Korea, both Koreas, published in Japan, the source of which being the Chosenshi Genkyukai database. We can see a sort of explosion of interest in Korea, particularly since after the 1980s. But for international comparison, I'd like to cite a table from Kimura Kan's work, who used the databases to Japanese Diet Library, the US Congress Library, and the National Library of China. As you can see, Japan is publishing more books, has been publishing more books on Korea than any other foreign country. In the first decade of the 21st century, the number in Japan is 4 times larger than in the United States, which may indicate a stronger interest in what is happening in the Korean Peninsula in Japanese society. However, if you compare the number of the PhD dissertations, again, the data from Kimura's work, dissertations in Japan and the United States, it is only in the first decade of the 21st century that Japan caught up to the United States academically, at least in terms of the number of PhDs on Korea. We also may have to consider the fact that a large portion of the PhD dissertations in the United States were done by Korean students. Entering the 21st century, Korean studies in Japan, I think, are facing new challenges. As we saw, the number of those who work in the field has increased tremendously, considerably, and their scholarly achievements have been advancing dramatically, both qualitatively as well as quantitatively. Its scope has expanded from history and literature to almost all areas of social science, with pop culture being one of the hottest topics of discourse these days. I would argue that Korean studies in Japan are entering the post-revisionist stage, to borrow again the term from Cold War historiography. Diversification and professionalization are dominant trends. However, problems inherent to compartmentalization and fragmentation are becoming increasingly evident, problematic. And particularly, I'd like to point out 2 problems. The first, The first is the waning, decreasing, weakening intellectual influence of Korean studies in Japanese society. In the middle of global anti-intellectual populism, Japanese academicism, academy on Korea, seemed to be helpless in facing the spread of the derogatory Kenka hate Korea wave. Second, some are even reverting to the traditional view of Korea amid the rising tendency toward conservatism. Traditionalist meaning a sort of condescending view of Korea, both Koreas. And the past decade of the Abe restoration. Abe restoration is the title of a book published a couple of years ago by, I think, American, the scholar, political scientist Craig Mark. So the past decade of the Abe restoration, meaning it's a kind of the Meiji restoration, kind of similar to Meiji restoration, has changed Japanese landscape in politics and society significantly. Abe's Japan has actively tried to use the emerging new Cold War to balance the rising power of China and to check on the pace of overcoming the Cold War division in the Korean Peninsula. With the coming of the new Cold War, East Asia is facing a new challenge of internal division and mutual antagonism, eliciting concern about another San Francisco system in which national security discourses prevail over historical justice and regional solidarity. In facing with these challenges, I'd argue that Korean studies in Japan needs to rebuild itself as a comprehensive and really interdisciplinary, rather than compartmentalized academic endeavor that can provide more balanced analysis of the realities in the Korean Peninsula to the Japanese public and society. After reading Professor Kwan's and Lee Nam-hee's papers, I thought I should have prepared my presentation in a more thematic and focused way. And maybe I think I misunderstood the purpose of this conference or this session. I thought I was requested to give an overview of the past, the present, and the future prospect of Korean studies in Japan. So on more details, I'd like to share more of my thoughts in the coming the panel discussion and question and answer sessions. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.